Is that okay?
Yes.
On the question of ringtones, if by any chance any of you have got the Clash doing Police and Thieves, you're allowed to leave it on. I wanted to start really by saying that I don't know if any of you have watched the TV series The Life on Mars and the follow-ups whose name I've forgotten because they were just so poor. But one of the things that struck me was that there was a message within that programme that has almost become the accepted common sense notion about policing. That back then, whenever then was, the 70s, 80s, etc., the police were essentially thick, corrupt, violent and prejudiced, and now they're well educated, highly forensic, sophisticated and possibly even liberal. And certainly that's the view that the modern police want to portray of themselves. That all of that went before is completely alien to what they do today. And certainly again, if one looked at people like Ian Blair or Sir Paul Stevenson, it is hard to imagine them saying the sorts of things that leading cops were saying back in the 70s. There was a man in Manchester, who some of you may remember, called James Anderton, who explained, Manchester's chief constable, who explained that his targets were social nonconformists, malingerers, idlers, parasites, spongers, frauds, cheats, and, lastly, interestingly enough, unrepentant criminals. And went on to denounce homosexuals and those with AIDS as swirling in a cesspit of their own making. He got his comeuppance, his daughter came out as a lesbian. But nevertheless, there was, some of the portrayal is actually true. They were thick, they were corrupt, they were violent, and they were prejudiced. A number of the most senior police squads, some of the most senior and glamorous police squads, the Fraud Squad, the Vice Squad, the Flying Squad, after which the Sweeney, a whole TV series was based, all of them at some point in the 70s faced major investigations which saw major corruption, major fraudulent activity, and even, amazingly enough, even on occasions, leading policemen actually being sent to jail, which was unthinkable. The huge miscarriages of justice that took place, the Birmingham Six, the Guildford Four, Winston Silcott, the Bridgewater people, and all of these, they're looked back on now as failings of the judicial system. But it is worth remembering that the starting point of the corruption of those convictions, the starting point of innocent people being locked up, began in the police stations. They began with the arrests of those people. They began with the violent beatings that those innocent people had to endure. They began with the forged confessions that were obtained. They began with evidence that was either deliberately mislaid or misheld, or else fabricated. They began indeed with the cops. Indeed, anyone who saw, who remembers the time, knew that the police were absolutely central to those miscarriages. Again, I mean, I was listening to a radio programme recently, and it was about football hooliganism back in the day. And no doubt somebody will someday write a sort of nostalgic view of back in the day when football hooligans were decent people who only beat up football hooligans and so on. But nevertheless, I heard this cop being interviewed, and he said the thing was about football hooligans, we liked them. We were young guys. We liked the scrap. We like to go out there on the Saturday and have the fight with these guys, and so on. And he also talked about the miners' strike, and you know, the famous waving the £20. He said it was only a joke. It was only a joke that we were waving all our overtime wage packets at people who were literally finding it impossible to feed their families and so on. And of course, as well as all that, back in the day, they killed people on demonstrations, funnily enough. In 1974, Kevin Gately, a young student from Warwick University who went on an anti-national front demonstration in Red Line Square, just up the road from here, was hit in the head either by a police horse rider or by a police truncheon, one or the other, and was killed. In 1979, Blair Peach, a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, a committed anti-racist fighter, was murdered by the police in Southall, protesting against the National Front. And the police were able to do these things absolutely free of fear that there would be any comeback when they did them. For example, if you look back, one of the most astonishing things about the huge miscarriages of justice was that when each and every one of them was exposed to be a miscarriage of justice, when each and every one of them showed quite clearly that the police had done dreadful things in the process, although lots of innocent people spent many, many years in jail when they shouldn't have, not one single police officer spent 1 minute in jail for any of those miscarriages of justice. Indeed, at the time when the Birmingham Six first sought to appeal their case, Lord Denning, who was the Lord Chief Justice at the time, an extremely right-wing judge from, I think, Wiltshire or somewhere, said when he was giving his verdict, there's nothing against Wiltshire, they're unfortunate. If anybody here is from Wiltshire, I'm sorry that you had to share the place with Lord Denning, but there you go. But Lord Denning, he said when he rejected their right to appeal, he said if the 6 men failed in their appeal, it would just mean, I won't do the accent, that much time and money and worry would have been expended by many people to no good purpose. If they won, it would mean that the police were guilty of perjury, that they were guilty of violence and threats, that the confessions were involuntary and improperly admitted in evidence, and that the convictions were erroneous. That would mean that the Home Secretary would have to either recommend that they be pardoned or remit the case to the Court of Appeal. That, he said, was such an appalling vista that every sensible person would say it cannot be right that these actions should go any further. That was the attitude of the judiciary to the police, who therefore believed they could literally get away with murder, and did. And of course, the most shocking example of that was the one of Blair Peach. There were many eyewitnesses to what took place when Blair was murdered. There were statements, one eyewitness said the following: as the police rushed past him, one of them hit him on the head with a stick. I was in my garden and saw this quite clearly. He was left sitting against the wall. He tried to get up, but he was shivering and looked very strange. He couldn't stand. Then the police came back and told him, "Move, come on, move." They were very rough with him, and I was shocked because it was clear that he was seriously hurt. He died, and again, despite witnesses, not a single policeman was arrested. What's more, when the investigators went in, and at the time it was the Special Patrol Group, a notorious bunch of bastards actually, who'd been specially put together to deal with demonstrations. I don't know if any of this sounds vaguely familiar to you, but a force specially put together for these sorts of activities. When they searched the lockers, when the investigative officers searched the lockers of the SPG, they found koshes, knives, bayonets, swords, and Nazi regalia. Now, you'd think if you found all that, you could manage one prosecution out of the whole process. Not a single person was even disciplined. And it's interesting that Stevenson is now saying that the internal report of the time, which was done by Commander John Than, who is thought to have called for some prosecutions and discipline of officers, that it should now be published. And that's to be welcomed. Delighted it's going to be published, with the following caveats: it's 30 years too bloody late, and it's also going to be reviewed before publication, which always worries you as to exactly what they're going to take out. In doing so, however, what he's saying is we're different. We're open. We're accountable. We're fair. We're very open. There used to be an old joke where somebody says to Stalin, Comrade Stalin, back in America, we're allowed to criticize the president of the USA. And Stalin replies, yes, and here in Russia you're allowed to criticise the President of the USA. What's the problem? It's a bit like that. Yes, we're fair, open and accountable. As long as it was 30 years ago and not a single one of us was around at the time, we'll certainly be accountable. In this version of policing, it's the version of policing they've tried to sell ever since the Stephen Lawrence affair. The Stephen Lawrence affair marked, if you like, the moment when even official society began to brand them and recognise them for what they were. Stephen, an 18-year-old black student, was stabbed to death by racist thugs, none of whom were successfully prosecuted. And this was due to incompetence by the police, it has to be said, just plain stupidity, but also by